Hello, my name is Medhat, and today I'm going to talk about JWT authentication in ASP .NET Core 2.1. Let's get started. I'm going to create a new project. It's going to be an ASP .NET Core web application. I'm going to call it JWT authentication. The template I'm going to choose is API. This one here. And even though I can select authentication, for example, I can choose individual user accounts. But then it asks me for a domain name and an application ID and so on. And this assumes that I want to authenticate against a service out there. But that's not exactly what I want to do. I want to just authenticate against credentials in a database. And that option is not available at the moment. So I'm going to cancel out of this and just continue because I will build that database support manually. Now, I'll be needing two folders. The first folder I'll be needing is a data folder. So I'm going to add a data folder. And the other one is a view models folder because I will be needing some view models. So these are the two folders that I just created, data and view models. Since I want to be working with a database, I definitely need to have a DB context class. So inside of the data folder, I'm going to add a class, and the class I'm going to call application DB context. So this is the name of the class that I'm about to create. Let me click on add. The code for the application DB context is this. Let me resolve the namespaces. Okay, so all the namespaces have been resolved. Let's see what this class looks like. The application DB context inherits from the identity DB context and it acts on the identity user. This is the constructor, and this on model creating method, it takes a model builder object. We pass on this builder object to the parent class, and here is some seeding mechanism. As of ASP.NET 2.1, there is support for seeding. Prior to that, we had to sort of build our own system for seeding, and it typically used to be in a class by itself. But now you can build this straight into the context. Here I'm instantiating an identity role object and giving it an ID, a name, and a normalized name. And these are sort of built-in properties of the identity role. So that is my application DB context. I can close this. The next thing I want to do is, because APIs are non-visual, if you're going to authenticate against this API service, you have to pass username and password. So I want to create the view model for my login. So I'm going to come to the view models folder and add a class here. And the name of my class is going to be login view model. This is the code for my login view model. Just username and password. Now this is important because when you do login through Postman or through your client Angular app or an Android app and so on, you have to use username as the property of your username and password to be the property of your password. So these names are important. So we take note of these. The other thing that we can also allow in a service is for users to register. So if you don't have a username and password, we're going to allow you to register. So let's add another view model here, which is the register view model. So the code for the register view model is this. When you register, we'll ask you to register with email, and this email is going to be your username. So we annotate the email with the fact that it is an email address, so the model will be validating the email address, and we want to make that required. And also, we'll make the password required. We definitely need a connection string. And the connection string, it would be going into this app settings file in your project. So let's add a connection string. This is going to be my connection string. The name of the connection string is going to be default connection, and this is the server. The name of the database is going to be called JWT authentication, and the rest is just standard stuff that you put into the connection string. I'm going to paste these settings in here. I have a group here of configuration items under JWT. And I have a site which I call www.security.org, your organization belongs to. A signing key. As a signing key, I put some names of cities here. Expiry in minutes. My token is going to expire after 60 minutes. If you want it to expire after days, you can just convert the number of days into minutes and stick it in here. We have to, at some point, associate the context class with the connection string. And this is typically done in the startup.cs file in the configure services method. So let's open up the startup.cs file. And this is the configure services method. We're going to put some code right here. And this code associates the connection string with the context class. So this is the code that associates the context class with this connection string. I have to resolve these namespaces. And of course, here we specify that we're going to be using SQL Server. The other thing I need to specify is the fact that we're going to be using identity framework to do our authentication. So this is the code where you specify that you're adding identity framework to this. Let me resolve these namespaces. Here, I specify some of the rules that will govern the way that I use identity framework. And what are the rules that govern the password, for example? I can specify whether or not I want a digit in the password. In this case, I'm saying I do not want a digit in the password. What is the minimum length of the password? It should be 6. Do I need an alphanumeric character? And I'm going to say no. In reality, you probably want to add these restrictions, but because I want to keep it simple today, I'm saying no to most of these. Require uppercase no, require lowercase no. And identity framework is going to be using the application DB context, and I'm going to be adding the default token providers because I'm going to do some token authentication today. We haven't really talked about the controllers. We haven't even run this application. Let us run and see what it does. I'm going to go Control F5. See what we've got. And we'll discover that we do have a controller here. And this controller probably just delivers values. And here it is. We have a values controller. What we want to do is to make it such that you cannot see this values controller unless you're authenticated. That's the whole objective. We need an authentication controller. And that authentication controller will be responsible for saving a new user and for authenticating that user and providing a token. Let's go back to our app here and add a controller. And this controller will be an empty controller. And I'm going to call this controller the authentication just auth controller. You can call it whatever you like. Let's go add. Now I've got some code for this controller. So here's the code for this controller. And we're going to discover that basically we have two action methods. We have an insert user, which basically is register, and we have a login action method. Let's resolve these namespaces. Now in this code, we will have two endpoints. The first endpoint is to add a user, and we can simply specify it as the register endpoint. This basically means that when we access this endpoint, we're just going to go /register. We don't need to go API register or anything like that. /register will do it. And the other endpoint is also /login. And this will allow us to pass the username and password, and will be authenticated here. Before I explain this code, there are some name value pairs that we'll be needing in order to set up our token. And the token requires a signing key, which is like a secret. It requires the expiry in minutes. And we have information about the issuer and the audience, and I'm calling it by this key. So this is where these values are coming from, these ones here. So first let's look at register, because we want to register first. So when we insert a user, the object that's going to come through here is our register view model object. And if you remember, our register view model object is composed of an email and a password only. We're going to instantiate this object, the identity user object, with email, username, and a security stamp. The security stamp will be simply a GUID. We're going to use the user manager create method. And where does the user manager come from? Well, it is injected here through dependency injection. So these are the instance variables, and here these objects are being injected through dependency injection. We're using the user manager, and we're interested in the configuration object too. And why do we care about the configuration object? Because it helps us retrieve these keys that are coming in from the app settings.json. So that's where these two objects come from. Let's go back here. So our user manager, we're going to use it to create a user. We pass it the user object, which we instantiated here, and we pass it the password that the user has chosen. If the user has indeed been created, then what we can do is we can add this user to the customer role. And remember, the customer role, we actually seeded that in the application DB context. Let's go to the application DB context, and you will see here that we actually seeded two roles, the admin role and the customer role. So as soon as a user is registered, we're going to immediately add them to the customer role. And we're going to return the new username. We need to add some code into the startup.cs that indicates that we're using token authentication. There's one more chunk of code that goes into the configure services method. This is the code. And before I explain what it is, let us resolve the namespaces. So we're going to add authentication to this application. The default authentication scheme is going to be JWT. So when you specify that it's going to be JWT, you reference the authentication scheme belonging to the JWT bearer defaults. The challenging scheme is going to also be the JWT defaults authentication scheme. And also the default scheme will be that scheme too. We're going to add a JWT bearer object with these options. We're going to save the token. We're going to require some HTTPS metadata. And the token validation parameters are going to be some of the claims that come with that token. We're going to validate the user, the audience, and we're going to validate that the audience is this site. This is when we are authenticating. And the issuer is also this site that's in our configuration file. And our signing key is going to be this key converted into bytes and signed with the symmetric security key class. So that's going to be our signing key. Now, after doing that, we come here and we're going to say, okay, we're going to use authentication, because up to now, unless in the configure method you say, yes, I'm going to use this service, it will not use the service, because simply defining it in the configure services method is simply an intent. And putting it into the pipeline comes when you add it in the configure method. So I'm going to go use authentication here. We need to make migrations, database migrations, before we can start using the database. So there are really two commands that we need to run. And we'll do them from the package manager. So let's go into tools, NuGet package manager console. And let's run those two commands. The first one is add migration, and we'll give it a name. And the second command is update database. Okay, at this point, we should have a database. Let's check. And here is our database. It's been created. Let's see if we have any tables. And sure enough, we have all the identity framework tables that are pretty much built into ASP.NET Core. So let's run this. If I run it, I still can get at the values controller, but I want to restrict that. So to restrict it, all you have to do is put the authorize annotation on top of the controller. So let's do that. Go to the values controller, and at this level, we can put the authorize annotation. And of course, this has to be resolved. Now let's try. If I come here and refresh, it's going to give me a 401. Which essentially means you're not authorized. How do I register? So to register, I need to go to an app and pass my username and password from the app. Let me use Postman for this. So I do have Postman. So using Postman, I'm going to try and register a user. So what we want to do is point to that register endpoint and pass a JSON object that includes email and password. And going back to our endpoint, which is in the authentication controller, this endpoint responds to the post method, HTTP post. So back in Postman, I'm going to choose post here. And in the body of my request, I'm going to send a raw JSON object. So here what I've done is I first chose post, then body, then row, and JSON. What's missing is I haven't yet put an endpoint, but I'll do that in a second. So the actual object that I want to send is this. So this is what I want to send. I want to send an email address and a password. Now the endpoint I'm going to copy from here. So my endpoint will be this /register. And hopefully now I can send my request to the server and see what happens. Let me click on send. And we get a 200, which means this is successful. We have registered a user. Let's go into the database and have a look. So if we come here, refresh, and come to the user table, and view data. And sure enough, here's our user. So we were able to register. Now, let us log in and see what happens. Before we log in, let's understand the action method on the server. What does it do? So I'm going to go to the authentication controller. We've actually already inserted a user, so we know what this does. Now let's see what the login endpoint does. The login endpoint takes a username and password. We're going to find the user by name and pass it the username. If what we get back is not null, we're going to check the password to see whether that's legitimate. So we're going to use the check password async method. And if this passes 2, then we'll instantiate a new claim based on this username. We're going to get the key that we have in the configuration file. And using this symmetric security key algorithm, we're going to extract a key from that configuration file. We're going to check what is the expiry time in the configuration file, and we convert it to an integer. This is where we're going to create a security token. The security token is going to be based on this issuer, this audience, the expiring minutes, and the signing credentials. This is 2 claims, an expiry time, and a signature. This is what we're getting here. Now, we know that the user is legitimate. We're going to return a JSON object with a token property and an expiration property. If the user is not legit, we're going to send back unauthorized. So now let's see if we can log in. We go to Postman. We change the endpoint here to login. Now going back to the login action method, it also requires HTTP post. So we have to choose post as well in our endpoint, which it is already post. And we want to pass username and password. We notice that in our login view model, it's expecting a username, not an email. So I'm going to change email to username. So this is what I need to pass to that endpoint. And the rest is the same. Let's send. And what do we get? We get our token, exactly as expected. We have a JSON object with two properties. One of them is token, one is expiry date. Now, in order to get my values data, I need to pass this token. So let me copy this into memory, put it in Notepad for the moment, and I have a quotation at the very beginning which I have to delete. So this is my token. If I want to reach that values endpoint, I have to pass this token. So let's say I add another tab here, and using the get method, I want to go to my endpoint. So my endpoint would be HTTPS localhost :44346/API/values. And if I hit enter here, send, you will notice that it says unauthorized because I haven't passed the token. If I do pass the token, with any luck, I should be able to get that data. I will be authenticated. So let's do it properly. The way we have to do it is we have to choose authorization here. And in this drop-down list, we can choose bearer token. We got a field here for us to enter the token. So I'm going to copy the token from my notepad and paste it in there. And the rest is the same. We don't do anything else. We don't need to send anything in the body of our request. This token is going to be packaged inside of the header part of the request. So let's click on send. And there you go. We got our data. Even though this is a very simple example that we're doing with the values controller, it pretty much applies to any kind of controller you want to have out there. It all works. Another way of doing this is if you go to the headers, you will see that what our header looks like is it's got a key called authorization. The value of that key is the word bearer followed by a space followed by the token. This is the way it's done. This was done for us by Postman when we selected this option here, which is bearer token. It sort of added the word bearer followed by a space, then the token. With this token that we have, I can go to the JWT.io website and reverse engineer this token so that I can glean into the information that's in it. So let us go to JWT.io and see if we can reverse engineer this token and make some sense out of it. So I'm going to copy the actual token from here and paste it in this section. And already, after I paste it, it already shows us some information. Like the red part would be this. The purple part is this. And this, sure enough, is the issuer and the audience that I specified. But down here, it says that the signature is invalid. In order to validate the signature, I need to give it the secret. My secret is in the app settings.json. So I'm going to copy this, go back in here, delete what's in there, paste this new thing, and now it gives me signature verified. So this is what really happens behind the scenes. Thank you for coming this far in my video, and I hope to see you in another video soon. Goodbye.